Spectrovision Radio.
With music and the kind of romantic idea, the genius composer who kind of works for 2 years on one little string quartet, it really runs counter to library music, which, you know, was sort of composed, arranged, and recorded really, really quickly. And in a sense, in this sort of very industrial fashion where it's more like sort of dressmaking or manufacturing almost, you know?
This is Phantom Power.
Welcome to another episode of Phantom Power. I'm Mac Haygood. At the outset of the 21st century, a scholar named Anahid Kasabian published an essay on all the music we hear but never choose nor actively even listen to. Film and television music, music on phones, music in malls and stores, music in video games, music for audiobooks, music in parking garages. Kasabian was interested in what all of this unchosen, ubiquitous listening was doing to us as people. Whereas we are accustomed to thinking of most musics in terms of authorship and location, she wrote, this music comes from the plants and the walls and potentially our clothes. It comes from everywhere and nowhere. Its projection looks to erase its production as much as possible, she wrote, posing instead as a quality of the environment. I thought of Kasabian's work several weeks ago when I read a recent feature for New York Times Magazine. Reporter Ryan Francis Bradley explored the world of sync music, or music that exists to be paired, synced, with video. Today's music is treated like a free-flowing utility, writes Bradley. It's added to spaces the way air conditioning is, providing the right vibe for TV shows, YouTube tutorials, stores, study sessions. Where Kasabian was interested in how this functional music affects our listening and consciousness, Bradley is more interested in the musicians themselves. Many of today's musicians, instead of selling records, he writes, operate more like the people who once played the piano in department store lobbies, the organ at baseball games, or the accordion in 19th century cafes. Their job is to provide appropriate background noise for some other experience. Bradley estimates that the vast majority of the music industry, perhaps 90%, actually consists of this kind of functional music. We tend to think about the music industry in terms of stars, but most working musicians are really toiling away in these anonymous roles that defy our romantic ideas about musical authorship. In the coming months, I plan to do a series of occasional episodes and newsletters about the roles that music and sound play in public space. Today, I want to look at the hidden labor of the people who make the ubiquitous music that we hear all around us. And in order to do that, I'm speaking with Nessa Johnston and Jamie Sexton. With their co-editor, Elodie A. They've released a new book called Anonymous Sounds, Library Music and Screen Cultures in the 1960s and 70s. It's the first scholarly book that takes a comprehensive look at the early off-the-shelf music industry that soundtracked TV, movies, radio, and commercials. And it argues that these anonymous individuals had a major collective impact on the music of the era. Nessa Johnston is lecturer in screen studies and digital media at the University of Liverpool, and Jamie Sexton is associate professor of film and television studies at Northumbria University. If you'd like to hear the full version of our conversation, including their reading and listening recommendations, you can become a member at machaygood.com. That's also where you can sign up for my free newsletter on sound and listening, find Phantom Power merch, listen to our back catalog, and more. That's machaygood.com. All right, we are here with Nessa Johnston and Jamie Sexton, who are co-editors with Elodie A. of Anonymous Sounds, Library, Music, and Screen Cultures in the 1960s and 70s. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
So we're here to talk about library music. And as you astutely point out in the introduction to your book, a lot of people have no idea what library music is. So Can we start off by just defining it? Jamie, do you want to take a crack at it?
Sure. So library music, I would say, is basically music that is produced with the intention of it being then licensed to be used in media productions. So it's different from the score. So a lot of more prestigious productions have custom-made scores, but this isn't like made in conjunction with it is ideas, but not a specific picture. Mm-hmm. So basically library music companies produce a lot of music according usually to moods or styles. This is where the library comes into it. So they store this big library of music, and then all of this music can be used by anyone in their media productions.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well as film and TV and games and so forth, traditionally and still now, it's used a lot in advertising and newsreels and industrial films and training videos. And I think as media scholars, that's what makes it particularly interesting to study, because it's associated with sort of forms of media that maybe aren't considered particularly artistic, but that there's been more and more interest in kind of aesthetic or historical standpoint.
It is interesting to think about music as this kind of infrastructure that's helping move commodities as well as like narrative films and all kinds of things, that it's just sort of like this background sound that is doing all kinds of work that maybe we don't really notice that much. You mentioned in your introduction that, library music has a prehistory. Nessa, do you want to talk about like the roots of it?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of the oldest and most established library music companies like DeWolf and Boozy and Hawkes in the UK, they actually started out before the advent of sound on film in the late 1920s as publishers of sheet music for live scoring of films and newsreels and so forth. So that was the business they started in, and that kind of music performed the same function. It was music to accompany film, but it would have been played live by the kind of in-house orchestras of movie theaters. And then once you moved into sound on film and sound on disc, that was when these companies started commissioning recordings of library music or stock music that would then be used in films. And then as well as that, a lot of that music that you would hear from that earlier period up until maybe the 60s tended more towards the sort of orchestral style of music that you associate with cinema of the sort of first half of the 20th century. Whereas our book is looking more at the 60s and 70s, and that was when you had much more sort of diversity of styles emerging in library music, whether that was British, French, or Italian, or further afield.
So just to go back a little bit to this earlier era, by the way, we had a really fun episode years ago on this podcast where I spoke with Rick Altman, who talked about the silent film era and the live musicians and different ways of making sound effects and that sort of thing. But I wonder, are there any sort of traces of this genealogy between like these catalogs of sheet music and what we call library music today?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, yeah. I mean, I haven't really looked into this issue in as much detail, but it's one of the things I want to look at. But there are a lot of similarities. Yeah. I mean, not only, as Nessa mentioned, that, some of the companies who were doing this went into library music. But a lot of the sheet stuff as well in the silent era, that was often catalogued according to mood and style. So the idea of cataloging, tagging the sounds for specific scenes or emotional kind of elements in a scene, that element I think carried over. So it is very important, definitely. And certainly in terms of the music as well, early library music, there wouldn't have been a huge amount of differences between it and the types of music that were played at cinemas live, particularly with the more kind of, not so much the solo piano ones, but performances that had orchestras.
So you're talking there about like this manner in which because there was going to be this body of sheet music, it kind of needed to be organized in some way to allow the people who are going to accompany scenes to kind of know what piece to use. They're probably sight reading, playing this stuff on the fly quite often. What, did they organize it according to mood, or like, were there names for, I don't know, a chase scene or like, what?
Yeah.
How did this work?
It could differ because, so you could have mood, but yeah, you do have things like, chase music would be a catalog. And sometimes, in library catalogs, they will have kind of like little labels for tracks. And, they might say, would be suitable for these kind of scenes, for example, a mood. But absolutely. And I think, sorry, Nessa.
That's all correct.
Nessa, is this something that persists to this day? Because I'm just thinking about things like the capabilities we have in computers to tag things or what have you. Like,
absolutely, it persists to this day. I mean, all those companies that we talk about from a historical perspective in our book, like such as KPN, they have catalogs that are available to search online that use the kinds of tagging systems that are very familiar to us from any kind of information management technology, And actually, I was just sort of more recently looking at the more contemporary music libraries, and some of the vocabulary that they use in the tagging is a bit more contemporary, so it will include some of the kind of words we've been using, like action or romantic or whatever, but it might use words like twee or chill, those kinds of words, which you wouldn't necessarily see in sort of 50s or 60s library records.
Yeah, there is just something sort of fascinating just about putting the word library with music and then thinking about it being organized in this manner, like the way you would organize sound effects. Or, Foley sounds or any other sort of catalog of sounds. And I think the reason I find that intriguing is that, we have a romantic sensibility about music, that it comes from the interior of some genius and they're kind of spilling their guts in this sonic manner and expressing something that resonates with other people. And then to see music, if you subscribe to that romantic tradition consciously or unconsciously, sort of organized in this very, clinical manner, like according to its function, that really flies in the face of some romantic notions we might have about music. So did that affect the way audiences have come to think about this type of music, or the way musicians or composers think about this kind of music? Go ahead, Nessa.
Okay. That's one of the things that kind of really attracted me to this subject. Is one theme that's kind of run through a lot of the research I've done and some of the teaching I've done is the idea of sort of taste hierarchies, right? So I mean, if you've ever taught cult cinema and we're teaching films that are considered so bad that they're good, you will have to kind of interrogate these ideas of, well, what constitutes a good film? What constitutes a bad film? Can a good quality film be bad in other ways? Can a bad quality film be good in other ways? And similarly with music and the kind of romantic idea of the composer and the genius composer who kind of works for 2 years on one little string quartet, it really runs counter to library music, which was sort of composed, arranged, and recorded really, really quickly. And in a sense, in this sort of very industrial fashion where it's more like sort of dressmaking or manufacturing almost, And also, it's music that's kind of designed not to be obtrusive. If you look at sort of the academic, but also the critical kind of work on film music, initially when it's sort of writing about film composers writing specially commissioned scores for films, it's always been about arguing, that this is good, this is proper music, even though it's written for a film. So there's this sense that, film scoring was somehow selling out from proper composing, right? So there's been that kind of process of rehabilitation of the idea of film scoring, but that's completely overlooked library music, which has been as much a part of film, television, and media throughout its history. And again, like that's sort of seen as, okay, well, yeah, no, if you're a composer and, you know, your name is on the bill and you're writing a specially commissioned work, great, you know, but if you're a composer of library music and you don't even know what you're composing for, you know, you're basically a hack.
Yeah.
So then when it comes to the sort of fandom around library music, particularly 60s and 70s music, around sort of record collectors, DJs, crate diggers, and so forth, that's often been about sort of, again, a process of rehabilitation. Oh, well, this one's really good. You know, this one's really groovy. This one's, you know, got a really unique sound, that kind of thing, you know. So it's again, and it's that sort of romantic idea of crate digging, of sifting through loads and loads and loads of trash until you find the treasure. So yeah, there's multiple sort of ideas around taste hierarchies going on that I find really fascinating.
The romanticism returns.
Yeah, you can never quite escape it.
I can't wait to talk to the two of you about that rediscovery era that started in the 90s, because you both write wonderfully about that, and I am of that era. So I can't wait to talk about that. But first, Jamie, do you want to say anything else about these sort of, taste hierarchies or perceptions of library music?
I mean, yeah, it's generally been, historically not highly kind of considered, usually dismissed. And it's slowly stated, I think, the fact that it doesn't fit into this kind of romantic idea of music making is part of why it's been neglected a lot. I mean, it's not the only reason, but I think it's a major reason. And I mean, I think also that kind of lack of, individual creativity kind of feeds into kind of more romantic conceptions. It's also challenged by the fact that library music, it's often kind of doesn't make much of who's composing. So sometimes composers are not even credited properly, but often their names will be on there, but it's not really, it's the library company that's more to the fore in terms of advertising. And the people who play on it are rarely credited, certainly in historical library tracks. So that idea of, anonymity is kind of important as well. But again, it goes against this kind of romantic conception of music. And so I think, when scholars started looking at music, film music, let's just say, because there is film and TV music and they're slightly different, but, it was usually driven by this idea of there was an evaluative element to it. So even in histories, they're selecting mostly prestigious films and individual composers who they're claiming, this isn't just functional supported music that plays a role, but it's nevertheless still important. It's kind of an individual, creator. So all of those kind of factors, I think, led to further neglect of library music. But library music is easily neglected anyway, because it doesn't really advertise itself. So if you think about, library music is not a score as such, but it's also different from commercial music, which is obviously used in compilations a lot and which gets much more attention. And that's because commercial music is promoted very heavily. It's popular. People know about it. Library music has been quite happy, really, to only be known about by the people who need to know about it.
That commercial music is business to consumer, right? With library music, we're talking about B2B. This is music that is marketed, but it's marketed to professionals in the creative industries.
Yeah.
And it's designed to be ignored pretty much by the viewer. It's kind of designed to just be in the background doing the job that it's doing without people really noticing it. And that's why when it does get noticed by people, I find that extremely interesting.
And I think there is something that library music, stock music kind of anticipates historically, which is we're now getting into this era where music is used functionally all the time, right? Like if you look at the playlists that Apple or Spotify has, a lot of them are according to mood or function or the activity that's going to happen, very much like library music was marketed back in the day. When we talk about these anonymous musicians and composers, were there any advantages to working in this anonymous way. Can you talk about, as far as you know, the sort of production side of things with this kind of music? Was it lucrative? Were the musicians well compensated? Was it a form of steady work? Like, what can you tell us about?
It's hard to completely generalize because a lot of it could be different.
Sure.
But I mean, in terms of being lucrative, probably not, unless you compose something that gets used so much that you get a lot of royalties from it. But it was more of a kind of steady stream of income for composers and musicians. You know, a lot of people who played on these records would also be session musicians on commercial songs. So
I wouldn't call it lucrative, but certainly it was steady work, and and it still is in some contexts a source of income that musicians and composers can tap into, in addition to other things. There's certain chapters in the book that deal with that a bit more than others. Like there's the chapter that Elodie wrote with Carlo Nardi in particular, kind of looks at the working practices in the UK, France and Italy, and how, quite a few of the composers composed under aliases. Sometimes for like contractual reasons, because they might be contracted to compose for one label and then want to compose for another one to get some more money. Or in other cases, it was about protecting their identity as a serious composer from the separate identity of composing library music as a hack, a quote unquote hack. So the anonymity was useful for people doing it in some respects and can still be.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on the last point, I mean, it's important, I think. Nessa mentioned, some people didn't want that. Why did they know they made library music? Because it wasn't prestigious and it was sometimes seen as, a lower form. So they might just do it for a bit of quick money, but wouldn't want it known. Other times, as Nessa says, it could be contractual, that they weren't really supposed to do it. They were under contract. I mean, I think Delia Derbyshire was not really supposed to do it because she was under contract for the BBC. So she had the, what was the pseudonym she used? It was some anagram, wasn't it? Lila Roos or something?
Something like that, yeah.
Ah, interesting. Was the anonymity conducive to making more space for women in the industry?
Not really.
No. So women were still the rarity?
Yeah, I mean, there were women making library music, but it was definitely more men.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't like, you might think, oh, well, sometimes you hear about particular jobs in film and television because they're kind of seen as lower. They have more female employees, like say, so children's television, for example, tends to have 4 female employees and tends to be more family friendly. And that's partly because it's seen as less prestigious than serious television, right? So you might think that something like library music, because it was sort of seen as lower, might attract.
That is what I was thinking might have been the case. Oh, okay.
It's incredibly blokey, and every aspect of the scene is blokey. Like the people who collect library music now are pretty much all men. And the DJs who play it are pretty much all men. So it's kind of, it's all very male dominated.
So I think we've really laid out, what library music was, where it came from, who was making it. I would like to talk a little bit about your book in particular. What was the Anonymous Creativity Research Project? Because I believe that's what this book came out of. Jamie, do you want to start?
Okay, yeah. So it was basically we got a grant. I don't know whether you have to apply for grants a lot, but in British academia, it's a big thing now. So this was a grant that gave us some, mostly it was time to work on this, but also to hire a researcher, which was Elodie, and also for some kind of archival visits. So it was merely like we were, I guess, arguing that this is important and should be funded because it's been used so much, but it's been written about not that much.
Yeah.
So it kind of came out of that, yeah.
Yeah, there's one really beautiful sort of coffee table style book about stock music, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the David
But in
Hollander
term,
book.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a good book with some good interviews in it. And it's kind of a nice overview of lots of kind of key labels with lots of cool artwork in it. And it is a source we cite a bunch of times in that book. But, you know, it's a different kind of book. It's not like a
Right.
sort of academic study. And there was also like Philip Tagg, the late Philip Tagg. He did a bit of work on library music as well. And that's also been referenced a bit by some of the authors in our book. But considering how ubiquitous library music is, there's remarkably little done on it academically. There's also the library music film, which is a good documentary, lots of interviews in it.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, and that again very much focuses on the 60s and 70s, and then the kind of collecting and sampling culture of the 90s.
It definitely seems to be more. It's more from a musical angle, I should say.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really go into synchronization. It's more about, I guess, how people got into library music. I mean, and to be fair, that's how I became aware of it, through being a music fan. And,
Me too. Absolutely. Yeah. So more than once now, you've sort of mentioned this golden age of library music, 60s and 70s. And I do think that's a sort of central concern of this book. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about it, Nessa, and sort of what kind of questions you wanted to open up about this era?
Yeah, I mean, there were lots of ways we could have approached this project, really. Like, one would be to look at the whole of library music in its totality from the start of its history to the present day. That would be too big, although, you know, it does get referenced tangentially throughout the book. I think that what was productive about focusing on the 60s and 70s was the fact that the music of that era, for a variety of reasons, seems to have had a very strong cultural impact. And a bunch of times we've both been asked, you know, what is it about the music from the 60s and 70s that gives it that kind of cultural reach compared with new library music now or library music before that? And there isn't really one answer to that question, but there are a few different answers.
So, Jamie, what are some of those sort of, you know, musicological or musical
the 60s,
elements
70s.
that happened in the 60s and 70s?
I mean, I think one of the big reasons was because library music kind of exploded here in the later 60s. As I think Nessa mentioned before that, I'm talking crudely here, but before that, it was largely dominated by kind of light classical music. Yeah. There were some exceptions, obviously, you know, in the 50s, jazz starts to become in. I think also because the commercial music world was also, at the time, you know, there were a lot more kind of styles diversifying and stuff. And that feeds into library music. I think it's when library music really starts to engage with popular commercial music a lot more. It's not to say it didn't before, but and particularly these new styles. And you also get a lot of kind of well-respected composers as well. I mean, which kind of goes against the romanticism thing. But, you know, Morricone made library music. Well-regarded musicians. Bernard, I never know how to pronounce the name, probably Parmigiani, you know, the music conqueror. You know, he made a library music album. And
so more like experimental, not only popular styles, but like
library music. Yeah, I mean, library music also. I mean, I think one other reason also this period, particularly into the 70s, is that amongst the kind of musical cultures that it's become kind of well regarded in, there's also kind of a fondness for earlier forms of electronic music, and there's plenty of that in library music. Yeah, I mean, Ron Giesing made a very experimental electronic album for KPM too. I mean, Giesing's kind of interesting in the sense that because Elodie interviewed him, and you know, whereas some library music was people going in to sessions and having to produce so much during per session, Ron Giesing was completely different. You know, they just approached him and said, "You've got any things you can give us?" It didn't really even say that they had to be in a specific mood. They just had to be reasonably short overall, so they could be edited into films and stuff. So, And
Yeah, the Ron
don't
Neeson interview was particularly interesting because of the way he talked about that. Like, it was almost like there just seemed to be such a demand for more and more music from the different libraries, especially from KPM, that they were very much like, just give us a full LP of music and we don't want anything longer than 2 minutes. And they didn't stipulate what kind of music they wanted. They liked that he was making this weird electronic music. So it was paradoxically, for a type of music that's sort of seen as derivative hack work, there was actually a lot of room to be very experimental from a composer's perspective at that point. I think something else about the 60s and 70s that is important is that you were going through what, when it's happened more recently, we've talked about it as like a content boom, where because you had lots of new independent commercial television stations starting up, and you had lots more independent film and television production happening, very often on tighter budgets, and not made in-house, so they wouldn't be using sort of any kind of in-house composers or whatever, like the BBC's, the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. So you just had a demand for more and more music, and one of the ways to fulfill that demand was through catalogues of library music, and those libraries needed more and more content, although they wouldn't call it content then, of course, but it's kind of one way to understand it now, is to talk about it as the 60s and 70s as a content boom. And that coincided with a radical kind of cultural shift, where you had all these new forms of popular music and constant sort of new sounds emerging in popular music, and then composers of library music wanting to kind of emulate that in order to be current and to be contemporary. And also new technologies, new studio technologies emerging, and people having the opportunity to experiment with those new studio technologies. So there was a rule book that hadn't quite been written at that point, and that allowed a kind of explosion of creativity in what was in a lot of ways a very constrained environment.
Fantastic. Okay, so here's what I'm thinking. Maybe we can play a little Name That Tune. We'll actually listen to some of these tracks, some of which you actually mention in the book, many of which you do. And maybe we can just talk a little bit about, where these things come from and where they wound up. Sound good?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. I mean, that's Frolic. I can't remember the name of the composer, but it's the Curb Your Enthusiasm theme as well.
Yeah.
Luciano Michelini?
Frolic, yeah. I never remember who composed it either. I just remember the title, yeah. Obviously, yeah, Curb.
So the classic piece of library music that it definitely didn't make its debut on Curb Your Enthusiasm, right?
No. In fact, I mean, it's so yeah. Maurizio Corbella's chapter in our book, he opens writing about that piece of music, and it was used in a very obscure Italian film from the 70s, and has later emerged in Curb because it's ended up in the BMG catalog. Because I'm a big fan of Curb Your Enthusiasm, I remember Larry David talking about why it was chosen, and he said it was chosen because it's impossible to take anything seriously when you hear that piece of music. Yeah. But interestingly, I remember he described it as being from an Italian light opera. So for years, I just took that at face value, and I didn't actually realize that it was library music.
Library music for a long time, no. And that's the thing about library music. Sometimes, when library music is used as a television theme tune, it becomes quite ubiquitous. Mm-hmm. But the majority of people probably won't know it's library music.
Mm. I mean, it's been my way of explaining the project to people down the pub. Basically, is
really
I'll go, okay, well, the theme from Grange Hill, which is You know, if you're a Gen X from Britain or Ireland, you'll know Grange Hill. It was this kids' TV show. Or, you know, the theme from Curb Your Enthusiasm. Those are sort of examples that I use that people know right away. They're like, oh, yeah, I know that.
Yeah.
Well, that's library music. It wasn't composed specifically for that TV show. It was composed for a library and then licensed for use. So that's the way in.
Speaking of that, let's listen to another one. And this one is perhaps not as popular an American export, but it will definitely be known to anyone in the States. So I don't know if you guys will recognize this, but
Well, that's okay, BM one. I don't know it as a theme, but I'm pretty sure it was most, in terms of films, it was mostly used in Black Dynamite, because that used quite a lot of KPM music. But I don't know, is that a well-known theme in North America?
it was the theme song for a show called The People's Court.
Oh, yeah.
Which was an early sort of reality show where they took people who were going to actually file small claims court cases, and they created this studio, scenario where there was a judge and a bailiff and everything, and then they just filed in. It was an actual judge, and they heard the case, and it was extremely popular when I was a kid. And that was the music.
I mean, I know that the NFL show that uses a library track.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I know it more from Superstars. This is the thing about different countries, and because, library music can often be licensed in different places. So when I was younger, there was a kind of sports competition program called Superstars, and it's the same theme that was used on NFL. I think it might still be used.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
We'll look it up and play it for folks. So yeah, that's fascinating.
So what was the name of that? It wasn't Heavy Action or something like that?
Yeah, I think it's Heavy Action.
Mm-hmm.
By
Let
John
me see if I
Pearson. Okay, it's used for Monday Night
Monday Night Football.
Yeah. Yeah. It just reminded me of Superstars, but Superstars is not very well known outside Britain or even in Britain for people under a certain age, because it finished, I don't know, 1980 or something.
Yeah, but oh my gosh, that is certainly well-known music in the United States. So Jamie, your chapter really picks up on the resurgence of library music, or not, resurgence is the wrong word, I suppose. It's perhaps more like a discovery by people outside the industries that used it.
Yeah, people who it wasn't
of this kind of
intended
music,
for, discovering it and using it in very unintended ways.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it's kind of how I came to know about library music. I mean, I would say that my main entry points where I started to discover library music, because I'm pretty sure I wasn't aware of its existence before, was some of the kind of low recordings, compilations in the early 2000s. So there was Barry Seven's Connectors, which Barry Seven from Ad Enter X compiled a French and an Italian library music compilations. And then there were Luke Vibert's Nuggets, also on low recordings.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of main entry points for me. And I think it's early 90s, maybe late 80s a bit. I think the main reason is but library companies were undergoing digitization throughout the 80s. And consequently, a lot of the stock of the vinyl was, given to secondhand stores. And this is where crate diggers start to pick it up and discover it. So it's kind of an interesting little story of discarded records being kind of reclaimed by a completely different generation and a completely different set of people from whom it's intended to be used by.
And a generation that had been playing around with things like thrifted clothes, vintage records, but also just sort of like this partly ironic, partly sincere embrace of things like lounge music, exotica,
absolutely. I mean, it
Esquivel,
definitely
Martin
overlaps
Denny.
with the lounge and exotica phenomenon.
And there were like sort of like more boomer era people that were already going that way. So you think about people like, I don't know, like John Waters or the Throbbing Gristle album cover, the 20 jazz funk greats, right? Like that's got a very library music vibe. But I think it was really Gen X that full on embraced it. You just feel this aesthetic of like this kind of loungy stuff in everything from like, Stereolab's EP, Space Age Bachelor Pad music to like you were talking about Luke Vibert, and like his Wagon Christ stuff has this almost like found music. It was almost like vaporwave before vaporwave in the sense that, I mean, it's pulling from a different era of music, but there was something about this discarded music. And I think you kind of addressed this in your piece, Jamie, but like, I think you used the term exhausted commodities. I think that comes from Will Straw, which maybe you could talk about that. But there's something, I can't quite put my finger on what it is about it, but it's something just so delightful about this music that has been discarded or forgotten or cast aside, and then sort of immersing yourself in it and having this sense of discovery.
And live music is great in a way because it's like, on the one hand, it's quite ubiquitous, some of it anyway, in terms of being used in lots of media productions. But in another sense, it's completely unknown territory. And I think particularly if you're a musician and you're creating music, it's a kind of new model which you can use as inspiration, but also obviously more importantly, sample material. And, live music, unlike very, very popular records, it's easier to sample. Technically, I think you're supposed to pay some kind of money, but you're much more likely to get away with sampling a library track than a commercial record. So in the early 90s, particularly hip hop, there's a real clampdown on sampling.
Yep.
And I think library music became quite appealing there as an alternative source where you're not going to get sued huge amounts of money by Gilbert O'Sullivan, for example.
Right.
So it was quite convenient, but also it fed into crate digger phenomenon, as the idea of trying to find stuff that's obscure that people don't know about. It's not, it certainly wasn't then. I don't think it is now. A lot of it's not obvious material. So,
yeah. And I think in the hip hop context, like if you can take something that's really corny and flip it into something that's really hard, like that's an extra, gold star there in your music production.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So do you have any other thoughts about like this moment in time? Like you mentioned, like the 90s, this stuff was suddenly sort of like people were getting rid of it. And then crate diggers, it was kind of interesting moment where one form of creativity was discarding this stuff and another one was like ravenously lapping it up. Were there any other reasons why this might have been occurring in the culture at this moment?
I mean, I think the 90s is when you start to get the type of retro culture that, in the 2000s, Simon Reynolds writes about in Retromania. You start to have this sense of, Tarantino's films in the 90s that appear to be set in the present day, but feel like they're set in the 70s, like that's a sort of one example. And similarly with music, with the kind of sampling. And it's something that, I don't entirely agree with this idea that Reynolds puts forward, but this thing that you've kind of had in the 2000s up to now, where with sort of popular music and so forth, it almost feels like there's nothing new under the sun, and all you can do is kind of refer back and kind of take older music and maybe do something new with it, or maybe just evoke that music really well, you know? So it feels like the 20th century has sort of folded in on itself a little bit, you know, or the 21st century sort of folding backwards into the middle of the 20th century. I mean, I don't completely agree with that, but I think it's true in some ways.
Yeah. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about AI, and we're seeing things like Suno. I mean, it's almost like perfect for this application where you literally say, describe the scene that you want music for, and then it spits something out fully formed. So I know that that is beyond where your book Anonymous Sounds goes, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on where library music is headed.
Well, I think there will be a lot of AI library music, I would assume, but I don't know for sure because, as I say, I haven't really properly researched contemporary library music, but certainly I think library music's always been kind of like in conversation with new technologies and stuff. So you go back to the 70s, I kind of mentioned, you know, synth started to be used a hell of a lot in a lot of library records, not all of them. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I would assume that digital audio workstations are used by a lot of people to make library music these days. So it makes lots of things easier, doesn't it? Particularly like producing stuff, you know, home producers. So I think it's going to become more atomized in that sense. I know that it's not completely new anyway, because I mentioned the example of Giesin. But I guess more traditionally, it's someone writing a track and then going in to sessions and recording these tracks quite quickly with professional musicians. That kind of model is probably not going to continue because it's not going to be economically advantageous to library companies. And obviously they are, even though they don't release music commercially, they're commercial organizations. So yeah, AI, I mean, it's hard to tell with AI, but it's going to affect everything, isn't it, really?
Any thoughts, Nessa?
I mean, when you look at the sweep of history, you know, ultimately it's always been about finding ways to get music made that's cheaper and involves paying fewer people, you know. So it's weird because on the one hand, like when you research the history of library music and, you know, the musicians' unions relationship with it, you have a lot of sympathy for the kind of membership of the musicians' union because they kind of saw something that was potentially, you know, diminishing the earnings that musicians and composers would make. And, you know, the coming of sound was sort of the first big technological crisis really for the musicians union in the UK because suddenly all the musicians who'd worked in movie theatres were out of work, right? And then similarly, you know, the kind of the use of drum machines and the use of synthesizers and so forth, you know, that's something that's arguably putting your drummer out of business or putting your keyboard player out of business using samplers, et cetera, et cetera. You can kind of look at it one way and go, oh, well, you know, you can't really resist technology. That's just the way things are going. But you could also look at it from the point of view of, well, you know, it's not inevitable. Is it, on the one hand, musicians and composers can kind of potentially use technologies as tools, but still get compensated for the music they're making, you know, and arguably AI would be no different to that. But on the other hand, AI is something that could potentially be used by labels or conglomerates to basically cut out any kind of remuneration for people. And it's something that we've already seen happen with Spotify and why, you know, more and more people are kind of moving away from Spotify because of Spotify kind of surreptitiously pushing AI generated music that means that nobody gets compensated for it and squeezing out music that's been made by actual musicians who want to try and earn a living from it or try and at least get compensated from it. So history's shown us that you can't really resist these technologies completely, but you can potentially resist kind of devious ways of avoiding paying people.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where it all goes. I've really enjoyed talking with both of you about library music. past, present, and potentially future. The book is Anonymous Sounds, Library Music and Screen Cultures in the 1960s and 70s. Nessa and Jamie, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of Phantom Power. Big thanks to Nessa Johnston and Jamie Sexton for being on the show. Thanks to Cameron Naylor, as always, for editing. And a big thank you and fond farewell to Sarah Frosch, who has been assisting me this semester. And congrats on graduating. Our next episode is a big one. We're talking to synthesizer legend Suzanne Ciani. Can you believe it? Until then, take care.